G'day, I'm Rick, a man of history and your guide to the past. Today we're going to be stepping all the way back to the Middle Ages, to the 11th century, to the death of Edward the Confessor and the eve of the Norman Conquest of England. As with all of my introductory videos, however, it's going to be a very quick visit to the past. An introduction to the Normans and the Saxons, to England in the 1060s, and to the people who have a claim, or who thought they had a claim, to the English throne. But before we begin, a quick aside. I'm going to be talking a lot about Saxons. However, in the 1060s, or by the 1060s, Saxons had been in England for about 600 years, but they were not one people. England, or Saxon England, was not a single unified province, but instead was made up of a variety of people of different backgrounds and different nationalities. There were people who were Saxon in origin, but there were people that were Angles, or who were originally Danish or Norwegian, or from Ireland, or even were directly descended from the Celtic people and the Romani British people that had been here since before the Saxons arrived. Most of those, however, did live on the wild borders of Saxon England, or in Wales or in Cornwall. Saxon England then was a melting pot of people and cultures which look unified and the same to us now, but the five great earldoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia and Kent were different. They were originally different kingdoms ruled by Saxon or Danish kings, and with populations that were more or less Danish or Saxon or Angle or native Romano-British. The important point I'm trying to make, though, is that the Saxons were not simply one people or one unified country. They were a people formed from different origins and different backgrounds and different cultures who owed their loyalty initially to a local lord, and then to an earl, and only then eventually to a distant king. This was not the case for the Normans and the Norwegians, who followed a single war leader to invade and to conquer the country. The task of the Saxons was rather different. The leader that they chose to follow may not be the leader that would fight these invaders. All of which is really interesting and is the fodder for a different video, a future video. But for now, just remember that whilst I'm talking in broad sways about Anglo-Saxon Britain, Anglo-Saxon England, as if it was one unified, simple, single thing, the truth is much, much more complex. So this video will introduce the background to the Norman invasion to set the scene in England in the 1060s, to give you an understanding of how events stand by the summer of 1066. However, as I've said with all introductory videos, it's going to be a very brief introduction. There's a lot to cover and I can only really scratch the surface. My aim is to introduce you to the four claimants to the English throne, to Anglo-Saxon England in the 1060s, and its 6 centuries of history are very interesting and very much worthy of their own study. It gives you some idea of the robust politics of Saxon England and perhaps Europe more generally, to unpack some of the reasons why people might travel hundreds of miles to risk their lives for the English throne. But all of that aside, enough of me, let's speak with an expert. England in the 1060s was a rich prize, a prize worth fighting and possibly dying for. When the English king died, the king was Edward, known as the Confessor, a respected, pious man, but one troubled with uncertainty and disloyalty close to home. When he died, there were 4 who would claim the throne, but no clear heir. 2 of those 4 claimants were Saxon. Edward the Aetheling was Edward's great nephew, but very young. The other was the powerful Earl of Wessex, Harold Godwinson. 2 were from overseas. Harold Hardrada was king of Norway, and he was prepared to force a tenuous claim with military power. And the other was Duke William of Normandy. He had a claim by blood, though a distant one. His great aunt, Emma, was Edward's mother. But he would also claim to be appointed his kinsman's heir to the throne. You probably think of England as one single unified country, but on the eve of the Norman invasion, it's better to imagine it as a collection of small countries ruled by petty kings, with a single king who rules above them. And this was a reflection of life in general. Important men called thanes, lords on a local level, they held a moderate to a great deal of land, at least 5 hides, and a hide is enough land to feed a family for a year. They offered protection, leadership to those beneath them, who owed loyalty and service in return, and obviously taxes. There were 4,000 or 5,000 thanes in the country in the 1060s, but most people were not thanes. They were peasants, they were farmers who worked the land. Many were unfree, or they rented the land. They didn't own the land that they farmed. Others were free farmers who owned their own land, but who owed service, military service, to the local thanes still. The Earls, they were called. Saxons practiced slavery too, a practice that Normans disliked, and perhaps 10% of the population, men, women and children, were owned, mostly by these wealthy landowners. The most powerful thanes were called Earls, and they had other thanes sworn to their service. They were second only to the king in terms of power and of wealth and of military might. There were 5 Earls before the conquest: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia and Kent, and often, traditionally, Wessex was the most powerful, the richest earldom. Kings not only held great power, wealth and status, they were expected to be great leaders, which meant being great warriors, and being good lawmakers as well. They had to offer protection, wealth and peace to their people. Any king who was weak, a coward, or suffered defeat on the battlefield risked being challenged by the earls and powerful thanes. As a young man, Edward had been successful on the battlefield, but the last decades of his life saw challenges to his rule and military threats, mostly from the earls who were supposed to support him. This is most notably Earl Godwin of Wessex in 1050, who was exiled before being allowed back at the threat of invasion if he weren't, and Tostig Godwinson, Godwin's son, Earl of Northumbria, who was exiled in 1065. To shore up his support, to support his often troubled rule, Edward increasingly relied on support from Normans. Normans who he welcomed to his court, gave positions, authority, power and trust. All of which meant that the country was not as unified as would be ideal to resist an invasion. It was strong and it was economically powerful, with a professional rural warrior aristocracy in the thanes, strong military leaders in the earls and the king, each of whom, along with the more powerful thanes, had a professional bodyguard of housecarls, well-equipped, trained men for whom fighting was their trade. It was a rich land, and the throne a temptation to who any might seize it and hold it. In Saxon England, a council made of secular lords and bishops advised the king in times of peace and war. At the death of the king, this council gathered to select who would be next on the throne. It was not automatically the closest blood relation to the previous king. When Edward died in January of 1066, it was this body of royal councillors who would elect the next king. There were a number of different factors which were considered, different things which were important. Blood was one. A close familial relationship to the previous king was desirable, was important, was wanted. But other things were equally important, or might be more important depending on the time. Power, influence, skill in war, allies' respect, reputation, wealth and land. The blessings of the church all being named by the former king to succeed them. With Edward the Confessor's death, the King's Council had a weighty decision to make. Of the 4 men who had a claim to the throne, it is Edgar, great-nephew really, of Edward, who had the closest blood relationship. Edgar was the last of Edward's male line left alive, but he was a youth, 14, barely a man. Without powerful warriors or warlords to support him, Edgar had been raised in the royal court. He arrived as a boy of 6, and Aetheling means throne-worthy. He was familiar with how his uncle had ruled and with how England functioned. In times of peace, Edgar might have been a good choice, but invasion loomed and powerful foreign rulers had already staked a claim on the throne. A child could clearly not be king. The Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, was one of those foreign rulers, and he had an old claim to the English throne, but not through Edward or through any Saxon kings, but through Canute, a Danish king who'd been king of England too. England had been often ruled from Norway or from Denmark. There were many people in England who had Danish blood, and many of these felt that Saxon rulers were oppressive to their culture, to their ideals, to their way of lives. To them, Hardrada might appear a saviour rather than merely a conqueror. Additionally, Tostig Godwinson, once Earl of Northumbria, had fled the country and Edward's laws, and he had sought shelter in Harold's court in Norway. Tostig promised the support of his powerful family and his allies, and he promised further that the people of Northumbria would be loyal to him and would support Harold's claim. Duke William of Normandy had a blood claim to the throne, but only as a distant cousin to Edward. He had a better claim through the close relationship between Normans who had worked as part of Edward's court, and between William and Edward. They had a personal relationship. William claimed that in 1051, shortly after Godwinson of Essex had been allowed to reclaim his earldom after exile, something that threatened the king's power, Edward had visited William for advice and for support, and that Edward had promised the throne to William, making him his heir. This claim was strengthened when, in 1064, a powerful Saxon nobleman had visited William's court. He'd visited after being shipwrecked and given little choice in the offer, but this nobleman had given an oath on a holy relic, a box containing saints' bones, to support William's claim. That nobleman was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex. Harold Godwinson, he was the son of Godwin of Wessex and brother of Tostig, two men who'd caused Edward great troubles. He was brother to Edward's Queen Edith, though, and his younger brothers controlled London and East Anglia. Harold was a powerful warlord in his own right. He was a wealthy and respected earl, young, skilled in battle and successful in war. With a threat from Norway and from Normandy, two powerful foreign warlords with armies that could poise to threaten the country, the King's Council decided that Harold was the best choice to keep England safe. They argued he'd been compelled to swear an oath under threat of death, and that he hadn't known of the relics, so the oath didn't count. Further, on his deathbed, King Edward had promised the throne to Harold. Harold had proved himself a strong supporter of the crown, loyal to the king, and was perhaps the most important and powerful man in the country. There was only one who had any chance of uniting Saxon nobility to resist invasion and to bring peace. Harold was crowned in January, on the same day as Edward's funeral, and he headed north to visit Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. Whilst there, Harold married their sister Edith. This meant that Harold was related by blood or by marriage to the most powerful nobles, to the Earls of the country, something that should ensure peace and support in the face of external threats, or at least so we hoped. In January of 1066 there were four claimants to the throne. Edward's nephew Edgar, his distant cousin William of Normandy, his completely unrelated Norwegian neighbour Harald Hardrada, and his brother-in-law and Earl of Wessex, Harold Godwinson. The King's Council chose Harold Godwinson to take the throne, and, like the man of action he was crowned and married to the sister of the Northern Earls within the month. Neither William nor Harald Hardrada was slow to react, and though some months would pass, the obvious threat of invasion loomed throughout the long summer of 1066. The immediate succession crisis was past, but the story was far from over. But more of that another time. So, who do you think had the best claim to the English throne? In the end, it really doesn't matter. The Norman Conquest would come, and it was a real transformative event in the social and political life of England, and later on to Scotland, to Wales, to Ireland as well. The Normans were great conquerors. If somebody had something they wanted, they really only had one move: invade. one move, but they were very, very good at it. I've hopefully given you some idea of the reasons for the Norman invasion and the Norwegian invasion that was to come later in 1066, and to give you an idea of how they got there, the events of the 1060s that led to these really mighty and important events, transformative events in England's history. I really hope that I've set the stage for one of the great battles on English soil, the Battle of Hastings. More about that in a future video. If you want me to get to Hastings sooner rather than later, traditionally it is in October, do let me know and I'll try and bump that up the queue. Remember, if there is a topic, a theme, a part of history you'd like me to cover, please let me know in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter or on Instagram. If you like this video, please do like it, and if you'd like to join me again in the past, please subscribe for more. Until next time, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you soon. Farewell.